Well, it was only a matter of time until we saw each other again, huh? A lot of time has passed, as you can obviously see. But the reason you're seeing me right now at the beginning of this video is because I need to stress one thing. And that is because I first played Thief at its release, and I finished it the first time in 2009. The reason I'm even mentioning that in the first place is because of one thing. Within these 11 years... It's been 11 years. Whatever. Within these 11 years, I remembered Thief Deadly Shadows in a different way than what it actually was. In other words, parts of my memory selectively suppressed certain parts of the game while exaggerating others. That means that ultimately, Thief Deadly Shadows was positive in my memories. And it still is, just for different reasons this time. With that done, let's begin the review. Thanks for listening to me.
Thief Deadly Shadows, also known as Thief 3, is the finale of the classic Thief trilogy and concludes the story around Garrett, the, by now, legendary Master Thief. Several months have passed since the ending of Thief 2 The Metal Age, and things have changed once again. The Mechanists have been disbanded and they were absorbed by the Hammerites. The Pagans have begun their conquest and invaded the city with their human servants. A ship has sailed in the port, but on board were nothing but zombies, bringing a plague into the city. If that isn't enough, and trust me, there's more going on, the Keepers have begun to involve themselves more deeply into the city's affairs and have begun to try and prevent the upcoming prophesied Dark Age themselves. In the ending of the last game, Garrett has requested from Artemis, his mentor and member of the Keeper Order, to see these prophecies for himself, but the Keepers haven't responded to the request yet. And thus, our legendary Thief has returned to his regular life and is reminded once more as to why he left the Keepers in the first place. The major themes of this story are focused on the Keepers and the twisted magics within the city, while the Hammerites, Pagans, City Guard and the Lost Civilizations serve as the extra spice. Later in the story, Garrett is actually contacted by the Keepers and is thrown into a conflict that, for the third time, is threatening to destroy the entire world, forcing our Thief to step into action in order to survive. As this is the finale of the story, our favorite criminal may or may not have to make the ultimate sacrifice, metaphorically speaking. But you don't really think I'm gonna spoil this for you, do you?
I know what you're thinking. That sounds exactly the same as the first two Thief games. And, no. The way it is told is completely different. The formula is ripped in half. What that means is I'm gonna look at Thief Deadly Shadows with two different points of view. One viewpoint is gonna look at this game as its own game. The other one is gonna look at it as the finale of the Thief trilogy and as a sequel to Thief 2 The Metal Age.
The gameplay of Thief Deadly Shadows is similar but fundamentally different from its predecessors. You still have your light reflecting jewel, health, item and weapon selections, but this is where things get different. Let's go over the things that have been removed first. You no longer have a sword, instead you have a dagger, which means that melee combat mechanics are gone as you can only slice and backstab with it. You still have your blackjack, but now you need to be a bit more careful in using it due to technical inconsistencies, and of course, you still got your bow. Returning arrows are fire arrows, water arrows, moss arrows, which can be used to stun enemies, gas arrows and the noisemaker arrow return as well. The one arrow that doesn't return is the rope arrow. That's a shame, it was one of the most useful tools in Garrett's old toolkit. In case you're not sad about this yet, let's talk about items. A returning item is the flashbang, and this time it's not broken. Objects can't be thrown away from you anymore. Instead you have this little dingy pick me up and drop me gently please mechanic. The remote eyeball has been removed. All objects like flares have been removed. All mines, with the exception of explosive mines, have been removed. Strange items like frog beasts have been removed. And finally, consumable items like food have been removed as well.
If you've been busy in the video game industry for a rather long time at this point, this is gonna sound rather familiar to you. The definitional word for this is called streamlining. If you accuse Thief Deadly Shadows of heavily streamlining the mechanics of Thief the Dark Project and Thief 2 The Metal Age, then you're about to burn to death because you're right. Oh my god!
The new additions include gas bombs, which are flashbangs that knock enemies unconscious. While flashbangs were fixed, gas bombs are broken because they are more than perfectly capable of knocking down entire groups of enemies. Another new item are the climbing gloves, with which you can jump onto walls and stick to them, which can lead to some hilarious glitches and shortcuts. Finally, the last item is the oil flask, and these are just... On one hand, they are the most broken item in the entire game, perfectly capable of killing even the strongest enemy in the game with no effort. Allows you to kill enemies by having them break their necks by slipping on stairs, alongside more creative uses. On the other hand, it just sometimes doesn't work the way it was supposed to.
The technical stuff comes later. For now, let's talk about this Thief game and, most importantly, its new additions.
The first is the introduction of a third-person perspective, with which you can peek around corners as well as look at Garrett fully for the first time, in addition to seeing his limbs in first person, which adds a ton to the atmosphere. The actual addition of the third-person perspective isn't a good one, however, because it makes stealthing just a little bit too easy in my opinion, and it's easy to abuse it. The second addition are Garrett's new abilities and properties. His movement speed has been cut by more than 50%, which makes Deadly Shadows the slowest of all the Thief games. Our Thief also seems to have lost the majority of his physical strength in both health and damage. Also, for some reason, he seemed to have forgotten how swimming works, so he just drowns and dies now. The final addition is the one that, and I don't know why, seems to have become one of the recognizable features in a Thief game, despite it only being present in Deadly Shadows. A hub world. Yes! For the first time in the Thief series, you don't just jump from mission to mission, but instead you move from mission to mission yourself, by traversing the city and its districts. Naturally, within this hub world there are plenty of things to do. You can break into a few buildings to rob the place clean. You can interact with citizens by pickpocketing them, knocking them out and steal their stuff, etc. You also now need to sell the loot you gather by yourself by visiting the various fencers in the city. This includes restocking your equipment by visiting shops or remembering and stealing respawning items. These items respawn whenever a new day, so to speak, starts, so usually after a mission is over. This game features a total amount of 11 missions, but that depends on what you count as a mission. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Returning to the hub world, you can also, if you choose to ally with them, visit a Hamrite church or the pagan hideouts. There you can access some side quests, which are also found regularly in the city by exploring. But the big bonus of allying with them is to gain access to healing fountains, because your health isn't automatically restored after a mission is over. Just as an example, there's an entire optional level you can play if you let yourself get caught and killed by the guards. Within the city, of course.
Now all of that sounds wonderful, and honestly, the art design, the architecture, the music, oh! As soon as you hit the level, the atmosphere, BAM! Hits you in the face. The city just feels alive. You feel like you're a part of the city, just another resident in it. It feels like you can cut the atmosphere with goddamn knife. The problem is not everything is perfect. The issues of the city, however, are of a different nature for one part. All you need to know for now is that the city ultimately suffers from monotony and repetition. That is because each and every day, items, the NPCs and everything else respawns, so the city in of itself never changes. Considering that it's your only hub world for the entire game, that makes it tiring to eventually travel through the city, because impressive architecture, yes or no, but eventually you'll get visually bored with what you're seeing for the 50th time.
The storytelling has been changed to work with a different approach to gameplay. Instead of watching a cutscene before a mission, and sometimes after one is finished, the cutscenes in this game are sometimes unpredictable, which is a good thing to be honest, as it keeps the player guessing as to what will happen next. On the other hand, it can be very tiring during the beginning and the mid portions of the game. The main plot needs about an hour or so to even make an appearance, and the mid portion of Thief Deadly Shadows barely features any forward momentum in the story from Garrett's point of view. In other words, the slow story progression can kill your motivation to keep playing. Considering that this game, just like Thief 1 and 2, is about 10 to 20 hours long, you can imagine that the combination of a stale and barely expanding hub world with slow movement and slow plot progression could make this game a bit of a slog.
However, that doesn't mean that the story, the lore, or the storytelling in and of itself is bad. No! It just means that it doesn't follow a conventional formula. Many new players, especially those that joined after the 7th console generation or with it, PS3, Xbox 360 and Wii, are used to a very clear story structure or formula that they basically have to turn off their brains and follow along like brainless pigeons. Watch a cutscene, move from point A to point B, do whatever kill and fetch quest stuff you need to do. Watch a cutscene, maybe defeat a boss, walk back, rinse and repeat. Thief 3 isn't any of that. Thief 3 just takes the formula, rips it in half, flips over the table and doesn't give a shit about it. In my opinion, that makes the inconsistency of Thief 3 a positive thing. To the storytelling. Only to the storytelling.
I'm sure that all those that have played Thief Deadly Shadows have already noticed it, but don't worry. We will talk about the technical problems, and we will talk about them after we're done with the new level design. As you've already noticed, this game has heavily streamlined previous mechanics while adding some completely new ones, but this came with a cost. The overall size of a level, or even the city, is even smaller than any of the levels we've seen in the Thief series so far. This causes the levels to feel much more limited in what the player can do with his more limited toolset, and entry points in a mansion, for example, have been reduced as well. Most main levels are separated into 2 zones, which means that most levels have a linear structure with a goal at the end. This sometimes makes the game feel like an obstacle course instead of a robbery. That is what I refer to when I said the amount of missions in this game depend on what you count as a mission, as some of these small missions just feel like extensions of the hub world. A new addition to the levels are the inclusion of special loot objects, which you can sell for a high price, and they're always flavored with some neat lore. Unfortunately, later in the game you don't need any money because your equipment is stacked up and you have so much loot and money that you don't know what to spend it on. Anyway, how you deal with the game and how you play through it is still up to you. But combat is the easiest way in Deadly Shadows because, thanks to the changed movement speeds, there isn't a single enemy in the game that can outrun Garrett. So not only are there loading times within the missions themselves, but their design has also been streamlined. The result is that Deadly Shadows is not only the easiest game of the Thief Trilogy, but also the most underwhelming in terms of player freedom and design. Remember that you can now see the limbs of Garrett in first-person mode. Well, there's a problem attached to that. Your character's actual hitbox is not your player model. That means that the central point of Garrett's weight is still directly underneath his body, like it was in Thief 1 and Thief 2. That's also the case in most first-person shooters. Anyway, that means that unlike the game's conveyed visual information, you're still essentially an upside-down street cone with gun attachments. This makes platforming, jumping, or landing on precise locations an absolute pain. All of this, however, pales in comparison to the technical problems that Thief 3 has.
I shall fell the beast! Thou shalt receive... I shalt put an end to this sooner or later. Thou shalt hide no longer. Check near those shelves.
As you can see, the overall inconsistency of Thief Deadly Shadows makes it rather tiring to keep playing for the long run. That is not the part that will test you though. My memories completely suppressed this part of the game. It will test you, and I mean it will test you! And the fact that I have to reference fucking Deus Ex Invisible War! A game I never wanted to see or even touch again!
Each and every time you enter or leave a new area, you need to load. However, just like in Deus Ex Invisible War, the game needs to restart each and every time it loads a level. How much time, you may ask? Well, first off, the game needs to restart, which takes about 10.8 to 11.7 seconds according to my measure time. After that, the actual loading happens, and that depends on your hardware, the software running in the background, and the amount of detail within the level and options. So this adds another 3 to 10 seconds to each loading time. Considering that the levels are really small, that means that you'll be loading constantly, and it's extremely annoying to load for 15 seconds when you just want to travel through the city to reach the next story mission. In other words, this loading problem makes the hub world and its monotony worse by a lot.
Trust me, it may not sound like a big problem. It may not sound like a lot of time. But you're underestimating just how many loading times there are in this game. To finish a single mission, you need to go through at least 2 or 3 loading times. To finish, I don't know, want to go from point A, the beginning of the city, to point B, the end of the city? 7 loading times. That's roughly 1.5 to 2 minutes of loading. It may not be as bad as in Deus Ex Invisible War, but just because your shit doesn't smell as bad as horse shit doesn't make it any better. It still smells. It stings. The game just suffers tremendously under a lackluster technical execution in pretty much every single area, with the exception of sound for the most part. But speaking of technical execution,
remember how this game made a big deal out of its dynamic shadows? Well, it's eye candy only and doesn't have any effects in gameplay. Honestly, I think they should have spent the time to work on something else like the faces of the NPCs, but I think we're pretty much done with the bad stuff anyway. Again, I think the story is good. The lore is great. Garrett is as awesome as ever. The art style still holds up. The gameplay is fun despite being streamlined. The levels are still captivating, and some of the scenery in this game is absolutely impressive. The finale of this game is, in my opinion, the best out of the Thief Trilogy, starting with the Jailbridge Cradle, which I consider to be the scariest video game horror level I've ever played, followed up by a museum robbery that I enjoyed a lot, and lastly, the final level is the hub world itself, rewarding the player for all the time spent in between the story missions. Overall, Thief Deadly Shadows is still, despite all of its flaws, a fun game and a worthwhile time investment if you're willing to look past some very tedious nonsense.
there's a lot to like about the game. There's also a lot to dislike about the game. So let's start asking the questions. Is Thief Deadly Shadows a good game? Yes, but it suffers from too many technical problems that drag the game down more than it should. Is Thief Deadly Shadows a good stealth game? Yes, and honestly it brings a unique and individual flair with it that you won't be able to find anywhere else. Is Thief Deadly Shadows a good thief game? It's the weakest of the trilogy. Is A Thief Deadly Shadows a good sequel to Thief 2 The Metal Age? Unfortunately, no. It too heavily streamlines and doesn't compensate enough for it. It could have been more. It should have been more. But honestly, what we have is just good enough, in my point of view. So, one point of view of Thief 3 as its own game, one point of view of Thief 3 from the perspective of a Thief fan. I'm gonna give, as its own game, I'm gonna give Thief 3 The Deadly Shadows a 6 with a take a look rating. For the reasons I've already explained. You won't be able to find anything like it. From the perspective of a Thief fan, however, a 5 with a playable rating. It may sound harsh, but honestly, it doesn't hold up that well anymore. Not in 2020. And it was already pretty underwhelming back then, so I think settling down to a 5 is already doing it a bit of a favor. There's a lot of passion, there's a lot of detail, but what does any of it even mean if by the end of it I just wanna be done with it? That may sound harsh, and it's not fair to the, in my opinion, fantastic finale of the game. But it takes so long for you to reach that point, and when you finally reach it, the problems are still not gone. You're still being bombarded with more annoyances, at least slightly. There's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of good things to like. But these even each other out, if you know what I mean. It's hard to explain with Thief 3. I hope I did a properly good enough job. Well, with that in mind, and with that so far done, I have one more game to cover. But for that, I got this!